Okay, without further ado, we have a lot to cover today. It's very exciting. We get to talk about one of our favorite topics, and that's metering and measuring light. My name is Val Westover.
And I am Stephanie Adriana.
And recently, we just got hitched, so now we're Val and Stephanie Westover. And so with just a little background about ourselves, let me just, Kevin, can you hear us now?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yep,
I can hear you now. Okay,
oh
wonderful.
my God. All right. Thank you, everyone, for hanging on there. But let's get started because we have some anxious people.
Okay, so we are Val and Stephanie Westover, and we are certified professional photographers. I'm a portrait photographer. I've been a portrait photographer since the late 80s. And
that makes you old.
Yes, we specialize with we specialize with families, weddings. I do children, babies, headshots, and we do a lot of events as well. And Stephanie,
I specialize in boudoir. It's kind of like a no boys allowed photography. Val's not allowed to do that, or else we'd have rough waters in our marriage. So I do the boudoir, and that's my specialty.
The down arrow's not working anymore.
All right.
I'm just kidding.
Stop it.
Okay.
All right, and we also have an incredible coaching program which is for the beginner and the pro alike. It's customized to your needs, so it's pretty cool, and our coaching students right now are having a blast. We have lots of fun stuff that we're doing.
Okay, so we wrote a book, or I wrote a book, and Stephanie and I started teaching photography all over the country. What we're going to be presenting today is a portion of our course, and the online course is actually called Understanding the Basic Elements of Photography. So we are going to take a segment out of this course and kind of dissect metering and measuring light.
That's right. And so in our free time, when we're traveling all over the place, we get to take pictures because that is our thing that we love to do, and we create fine art with that. So you can find us in galleries and homes and restaurants and hotels all over the country.
Okay, well, let's just jump right into it. You got an email saying that we were going to present to you 5 steps to metering and measuring light, so let's get going. There's a lot of information that we're going to present to you today, so if you take notes, however you absorb this information, at the very end of this presentation, we are going to give you 2 options. One option, you'll be able to get our full online course at a discounted rate, and we also have a free way of getting the online course, so you'll always have access to this information.
Sneaky.
Okay, so measuring light. Measuring light for the correct exposure. And if you've ever looked into your camera and you take the lens off, you've probably, and activated the shutter, you've probably seen your image sensor. And with the image sensor, let's first break down what a correct exposure is.
Thank you. So with too much light, we overexpose, and with too little light, we underexpose. I'm sure you all have seen images like this come out of your...
Well, especially if you're shooting in automatic mode. And, you know, automatic mode these days does a fairly good job. However, there's times where the camera thinks it's giving you a correct exposure, but you're ending up with over or underexposed images.
Correct. So high quality images are achieved when the correct amount of light is striking your image sensor. And basically, isn't that the goal of every photographer, is to get beautiful, correct exposures on the first try, so you don't have to waste all this time in post-production fixing your images.
Well, what's nice is, you know, to use post-production for just a quick color correction, you know, white balance and just a tiny little tweaks here and there.
Absolutely.
Rather than spending all of your time trying to bring back detail and highlights.
Absolutely.
Because of over or underexposed images.
There you go. Light, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are used to achieve a correct exposure. Go figure. Those 3 things. So what is a correct exposure? Correct exposure means that the right amount of light is hitting your image sensor. Depending on our lighting situation, we control the sensitivity of the image sensor, which we all know what that is now, with our ISO. The desired ISO must be set. This is the very first thing you do before you meter a scene.
Now, back in the old days, I don't know if anyone in our audience has ever shot with film before, but back in the old days,
when dinosaurs roamed the earth.
Exactly. And we didn't have an image sensor, we had film. And so before we could determine what our settings were going to be, we had to put the film in the camera.
Absolutely. So once we set the ISO, we put the virtual film in our camera, we can now measure how much light is needed for our correct exposure.
So basically, high ISOs make dark scenes more recordable, and low ISOs provide more image quality.
Yeah, and depending on the kind of camera that you use, some ISOs with all these fantastical machines now go pretty darn high. And always the ISO, sometimes you can go to a 100 ISO, and some cameras are delegated to about a 200 ISO.
Now, we are going to be going over, certain aspects of ISO aperture and shutter speed just to put the basics in the forefront so that we can dissect how to meter. And you really can't start metering and measuring light unless you really understand ISO aperture and shutter speed. And we're not going to spend our entire time talking about that, but we're going to kind of cover it just slightly. So what is correct exposure? When setting the aperture and the shutter speed, it's important to remember that the relationship between the f-stop and the shutter speed is crucial to achieving correct exposures. Now, I'm not sure the skill level of everyone in our audience today.
We're assuming you're our pros here.
And basically, to meter, your camera is metering based off of f-stops. And you can take our online course that breaks down each one of these elements. For instance, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed have their own segment in our online course. And I recommend that you take those. But regardless, even if some of this stuff goes over your head, you'll, towards the end here, you'll start to understand how we start putting it together.
So aperture and shutter speed have that reciprocal relationship. And when one changes in one direction, the other must change exactly the same amount in the opposite direction to maintain a consistent exposure level. Each full f-stop or full shutter speed lets in half as much light as the full setting before it and doubles the amount of light the full setting after it. And these are just some examples on how that happens.
Okay, so when working with your aperture and your shutter speed correctly, this is when you will start achieving correct exposures. And so, for instance, you open up your aperture. Your aperture, of course, is in your lens. The diopter in your lens, you're controlling how wide or how small that opening is, allowing light to pass through your lens. And then the shutter opens, and again, you're controlling how long that shutter remains open. Well, this is the total amount of light that's going to strike your image sensor. So,
when and why to use your metering modes, step 2.
Now our camera has, digital cameras today have incredible metering, a metering mode,
Mm-hmm.
and it knows how to measure light, and it does a very good job at doing that.
Absolutely, and so thank goodness that we don't have to guess anymore. So that's why we use a light meter. Now the camera has a built-in light meter, but it meters reflective light.
Yeah, now I'm old school, so back in the day when I was shooting with my Hasselblad, there wasn't a metering system in that camera, so I had a handheld light meter.
Mm-hmm.
So when I transitioned to digital, and now I'm working with I actually shoot with the Canon 5D Mark III, and when I'm shooting with this camera, I have to use the metering system in the camera to get the same results that I was getting with a handheld light meter. Otherwise, I'd have to have my handheld light meter in.
That's right. So now what do we do if we don't have a handheld light meter, and how do we meter with the built-in meter that the camera has?
Well, let's talk about it. Okay, so the camera has a built-in light meter, and if you look at your little viewfinder on your camera.
Now we're showing a Canon. We're not Nikon haters. We love them all, but this is definitely a Canon.
You've got several different metering modes to choose from. And these meters, these light meter measurement, what it does, it measures light and it suggests the f-stop and the shutter speed that the camera recommends. So you have several metering modes to choose from, and every camera is different, but most cameras have 3 metering modes to choose from. Some have 4, and let's kind of break them down. You've got normally a center, a spot, and one that's going to meter the entire scene. So every manufacturer has different names for their metering modes. But what we're going to focus on, just look through your manual and you'll see the different names. We're going to try to present to you the names for Canon and for Nikon. If you're using a different type of manufacturer's camera, then look in your manual for metering modes.
And that's right. Sony and Olympus fall somewhere in between also.
So for center weighted, Canon calls that partial, and Nikon calls that center weighted.
That's right.
Everybody, I think, every manufacturer calls spot.
And then also, center weighted average is matrix mode, and that's the mode in matrix mode. And actually, for my Nikon people, the matrix mode, that little icon for that is an all filled in icon. It just depends on what your specific camera is. And like I said, please go check out your manual so you can understand it.
Well, regardless, what these metering modes are designed to do is to help you, as you want it to be right in the center. And that's what these metering modes represent. So Canon's partial, Nikon center weighted, the top one here, that's going to measure the center part of your scene. Spot, you have the ability to move that around in various different locations, and we'll talk about that. And then center weighted average, or matrix, which Nikon calls it matrix multi-segment, if you're going to measure your entire scene, get an average for your entire scene.
So every picture inside one of these boxes represents only the area that the camera is going to measure the light within your scene. So got to be careful with that. So just know, if all of your people in tuxedos are in the middle of your scene and you have it on center weighted, that is all the camera is going to measure the light for and do reflective light metering. Spot, it's the same thing. So just know, for your spot metering mode, that is exactly the same thing.
So now when you're using spot, most people know how to control their autofocus point, meaning that even when you're in autofocus, you can still move the little point or where the camera is going to focus. That spot metering follows where your camera is focusing, that focus point. And so just be careful where you are focusing, because if you're using spot metering mode, that's where your camera is going to meter. So just be aware of that. Now, we're going to talk about the exposure level indicator. The exposure level indicator, your camera is going to let you know whether or not it feels that you have a correct exposure. So let's take a look at this image of a monkey here, and let's talk about the exposure level indicator and, of course, metering certain scenes within this monkey's cage. So the minus side of the exposure level indicator. Now, for those of you who are perhaps new to photography, your exposure level indicator looks like a little ruler. When you look through your viewfinder in manual mode, you can see your exposure level indicator normally at the bottom. Some of you will see it on the side when you're looking through your viewfinder. And you have the ability in manual mode to control your exposure level indicator. So this little red line here determines a point that you would probably see that moves around within your camera. And you can easily line it up right here at 0 for a correct exposure. But we'll continue talking about that.
That's right. So when your image is dark or you're pointing at something dark, chances are your exposure level indicator will be on the minus side. So you'll, minus 1 stop of light or minus 2 stops of light. This
red line is on the 1, on the minus side. So this is telling us that this image is 1 stop of light underexposed. Mm-hmm. And this is telling us it's 2 stops of light underexposed.
And here again, so let's say we were pointing at this monkey and he was in a really lit looking cage and not in the dark. Now our camera is telling us that now this area is 1 stop overexposed and now 2 stops overexposed.
So ideally we want to line our camera up right at 0. Now this is important information.
That's right.
In program mode, aperture priority and shutter priority, the camera is going to be in charge of making sure that the exposure level indicator remains in the middle for what it thinks a correct exposure should be. So you don't have to move the exposure level indicator in these 3 modes. The camera is going to move it for you.
That's right. And it won't move. It'll always stay there unless you change it on purpose.
And the key word here is what the camera thinks is a correct exposure. So now when you're shooting in manual mode, you are in charge of moving that exposure level indicator of what you know is a correct exposure. Whether this makes sense yet or not, it will.
Just hang on, we're getting there. Yeah, the shoe is just about to drop.
Okay, so since both aperture and shutter speed control light the same way, that means that you can now either adjust your aperture or your shutter speed dial on your camera to move this little needle around. And so if you're looking through your viewfinder and you adjust your shutter speed, at that point you'll see that your exposure level indicator, that needle that looks, well, on the picture here that's red, you can move this needle around by adjusting either your aperture or your shutter speed.
So let's expand on that. Your camera measures reflective light. Understanding how your camera measures this reflective light is vital to achieving a correct exposure. If you point your camera to a dark area or a dark part of your scene, and usually in spot metering mode, since that area is not very reflective, your camera thinks that it needs to brighten up the entire area. Usually, it will overexpose the image if you're shooting in any of the priority modes.
And one of the things that we work with our photography students in helping them understand this is, imagine metering on a black wall, a solid black surface. If you point your camera to a solid black surface, your camera's metering system within your camera thinks that that is middle gray. It thinks that black wall is gray. So in automatic mode, when you go to take a picture of a black surface, you take a look at that image, it's going to look gray.
And for our pros out there, whenever you're photographing a bunch of guys in tuxedos for a wedding, that's why if you're shooting in any of the priority modes, it usually turns out a little overexposed. And that's because the majority of the picture is black because of the tuxedos.
And by the camera thinking that it's middle gray, it's taking what should be black and brightening it up so that it looks gray, and therefore you are overexposing the image. And the same goes if you were to point your camera towards a white wall. If you point your camera towards a white wall, the camera thinks that's gray, and now it darkens that image until it is gray, and now you've completely underexposed the image. Excuse me, yes, underexpose the image.
Correct.
Okay, so for example, if you point your camera and you zoom in and you're metering on a dark area of this scene where the monkey's cage is, you will overexpose your image. The camera obviously thinks it needs to brighten that area up. If you take your camera and you point it towards a brighter part of the scene, just for an example, we'll say the cameras are going to focus and meter off of the monkey's ear here, the brightest part, then it thinks that area is really bright. It needs to darken the scene, and now you've completely underexposed the image.
Yep, and that's why when you're shooting a wedding and you now go from shooting the guys in the tuxes in an automatic mode or a priority mode, and now you go to the bride who's all in white, now that's why, oh my gosh, now what's wrong with my camera? Why is everything so dark? And this is exactly why that's happening.
You know what I just figured out?
What?
You put your name on this picture. You're trying to claim this picture.
No, you didn't take this picture. I took this picture. All right. So therefore, correct exposure resulting in high quality image, you must receive that reflective light metering.
So for a perfect exposure, we're trying to find an area in our scene that is right in the middle of dark and light, right in the middle of pure black and pure white, a neutral area. An area that is, if this was a black and white image, it would be middle gray.
That's right. And even though we don't see in black and white, it's really easy for us to find those neutral tones in our scene just with your naked eye, with just looking around. You always know what is white in your scene or very bright, and you always know what's really dark. So find those tones that are in between when you do your reflective light metering.
Here's two areas in the scene that are right in the middle of pure dark and pure light, and if we were holding up a gray card, we'd get the same measure.
And when I was taking the picture of the monkey, that's what I had to do, is spot meter on a neutral part of the scene in order to get that monkey correct, because he was in a dark cage.
So right here it says finding a neutral area in every one of your scenes is quite simple. So all you have to do is find the area that is right in the middle of dark and light. And we're showing a gray card here. And again, like Stephanie said, we don't see in black and white. So we have to start training our eyes to look for more neutral tones in the scene rather than gray.
So it's easy. You can do this really simply by just bringing a gray card with you. It's kind of fun. Some of them come in cardboard, and you can find some that are more made out of fabric. Take that along with you and just place that gray card in your scene. And when you do that, you take your spot metering mode and you point your camera in spot metering to that gray card, and you adjust your settings to get that reading.
And we're going to break down how we meter in manual mode so you'll know the exact steps how or what we take to achieve a correct exposure.
So a gray card will become really handy. Now, believe it or not, Val did not take the gray card into the cage with these lions here.
Yeah, Steph, will you hold it right there for me so I can get a reading?
No, that would no longer be waterproof if I did that, watertight. So anyways, I'd be full of holes. Anyways, what you do is, since we couldn't take that gray card into the tigers or the lion scene here, we had to, with our eye, figure out what the neutral tone was in the scene. So how to achieve professional-looking exposures. This is the how-to.
Okay, we're going to use this image as an example. And so the image on the right, though, is going to show us in pink the neutral areas, that area that's right in between dark and light, so that we can help you recognize the area that we need to get a reflective light reading. So,
and chances are, usually, the blue of the sky, the green of the grass, those are usually the neutral tones in your scene.
So what we did is we took a look at this image and we found the areas that were exactly right in the middle of dark and light, and they're being highlighted in pink for us.
So you can see that.
So as you can see, there's some pretty big sections of the water down below that we can use to get a reflective light reading. Now, I'm going to backtrack just a moment because we talked about handheld light reading and we talked about reflective light reading. And we're going to break that down for you in just a moment, so we don't want to cause any confusion. But there is a big difference. Your handheld light meter is measuring the light that's striking the light meter. Your camera, your digital camera, measures light that reflects back to the camera from wherever you're pointing it at. So now, with that being said, all you have to do is point your camera to a specific area that you've recognized as the mid-tone, and then at that point, that's where you can get your reflective light reading. So in this case, it's not a very large area from where we were at the top of this cliff. So we use spot metering mode. We use spot metering mode so that we could ensure ourselves that we were only going to get a reflective light measurement from that area that we knew was a neutral part of the scene. So then after we use spot metering, then, let me backtrack a little bit, then we adjusted, as you can see on the bottom, we adjusted the shutter speed dial to move the exposure level indicator to line it up at 0 for a correct exposure. And therefore, we were able to grab the shot. So let me backtrack just a little bit. We used spot metering mode. We pointed our camera to the area that we knew had the neutral area of the scene. And if you look at the bottom of the screen here, we adjusted our shutter speed dial to line it up at 0 for a correct exposure.
So metering for the correct exposure, if you're not sure, it's always better to slightly underexpose than to overexpose, because it's easier to bring back shadows in detail than it is to bring back an overexposed highlighted detail. And yes, this is done. So by slightly underexposing your image a little bit, you'll make the blacks look blacker, which tricks the mind to see colors much more vibrantly.
And I think today we're just so used to seeing so much overexposure.
And the whole reason why is because, and I'm not knocking it, a lot of people are using their automatic modes, aperture priority modes, shutter priority, and by doing this, you're letting the camera have control over your exposure. Why don't we all shoot in manual mode and take back our control of our exposure? And then this way, you can have a lot more fun in post-production.
You can photograph her all day long, can't you?
Yeah.
This is Shauna's daughter.
My daughter, Shauna. Yep.
Oh, wait a minute. That's right. You're Stephanie.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
The one you're married to. Okay, so by metering for the correct exposure, you'll end up with mind-blowing images straight out of camera, and that's usually the goal. All right, so understanding your histogram. Here's something which when people are shooting, gosh, I've heard so many times, so many symposiums, so many different people lecturing, saying, check your histogram, check your histogram.
Use your histogram as a guide.
Oh my goodness. But when you're shooting in automatic mode, or if you're shooting in any priority mode, your camera is choosing to get the correct exposure for you. So it always thinks it has a correct exposure. So why do you even need to look at it?
Well, by checking your image and the brightness of the histogram, you can see whether or not your camera thinks you have a correct exposure.
Yeah, but what does it matter? And we'll figure it out right now, why that sometimes doesn't always work.
Well, let's first of all discuss what the histogram is and how it works. It's a graph that's in your camera. So if you go to pull up and look at an image, you can toggle. Some of you can toggle
your wheel, or there's a button and that to find the information on your image.
And at that point, you can access your histogram. And your histogram is a little chart. It's a graph, and it tells you whether the camera thinks that you have a correct exposure or not. The tone on the left, 0, represents pure black, and the tone on the right, 255, represents pure white. And the tone right in the middle represents 18% gray.
Go figure.
So the vertical spikes that look like mountains and valleys in this graph that go up and down indicate where the darks and the light exist within your image.
So basically, it's not about the up and down mountains and valleys. People get so distracted by that. It's basically about your bottom line. So the vertical spikes, those mountains and valleys, they tell you how many pixels exist for each brightness level. The taller the bars are in a specific region, are the more number of pixels having those brightness values. So if the entire graph, so here, let's also kind of focus on the bottom line. If the entire graph is leaning too far to the left, that means your histogram is telling you that your image is too dark or underexposed.
Let's backtrack just a little bit. If your entire graph is leaning too far to the right, then your histogram is telling you that your image is too light, overexposed.
Overexposed, yeah.
So a normal image, according to your camera, will have a full spectrum of tones ranging from black to white, well distributed throughout the graph. So the histogram gives you a visual of your camera's determination of your image's exposure. And most of the time it does a really good job. And you can take a look at it, especially if you look at your image and you know that what your eye is seeing is also matching what your viewfinder is seeing, and the histogram tells you that it's doing a good job, then we all know that we all agree.
Right, but what's interesting, do you know what, Val? I can't tell you how many times we've been out on expeditions and our students have come up to us and they see their histogram is leaning towards the right and it's dark. And their histogram is telling them that their images are leaning towards the dark side, and they get so frightened that they want it to be more centered and in the middle. And I'm going to tell everybody right now, if your images are leaning a little bit towards the dark side, wait till you get that image in the computer and see how gorgeous it is, because you will have your full spectrum of colors and detail, whereas the minute we start leaning a little bit more towards the light side and overexposed, you think that it's making it, the skin look more beautiful, but let me tell you, it's not real. What it's doing is it's just overexposing the skin. You're losing the detail, and that's not exactly what we're shooting for.
Now, I added a slide here, and let me talk about this for a moment, because actually this is a great example. And it'll give those who want to know more about their histogram and how the brain of the camera kind of works and really understand their camera, this could actually be a fun little exercise. So the top 3 images, the purple flower, yellow flower, and the white flower, were all shot in automatic mode. Now, if you take a look at the histogram when you shoot in automatic mode, your histogram is going to tell you, regardless whether you agree with it or not, the histogram is going to tell you that these are perfect exposures.
Right, even though we can visibly see on that top line there that the purple flower is looking a bit wishy-washy. It's a little overexposed. Now the yellow, because it's a neutral tone, a neutral color, here that's coming out okay, but here again, just think of your white wedding dress or that white rose. It looks dingy and a little dark, and that's in automatic mode. That's exactly what will happen. So consider the purple flower as your tuxedos, and the white flower is your wedding dress. That's what happens when you're shooting in automatic mode or any of your priority modes.
Now, you don't have to find a purple, yellow, and white flower. However, you can use a black, middle gray, and white card. And try this example. Shoot each one of them, do a close-up of each particular color in full automatic mode. And take a look at the images. not only look at the images, take a close look at the histogram. Your camera is going to tell you that you did a good job and these are exposed correctly when you know they are not. The only one that was exposed correctly is the middle yellow flower. So now let's take a look in manual mode. So in manual mode, we used a gray card to get a reflective light reading, and you are, each of these flowers are being hit by the same light. So at that point, in manual mode, when you go to shoot these three objects, your exposure level indicator needle will not stay in the middle. Once you move it to your desired exposure, that needle will now move to the left or to the right, thinking the image might be over or underexposed. And at that point, you ignore your needle. You know that you have measured correctly and you're going to take the shot. So in this situation here at the bottom, as you shoot for correct exposure on all three flowers, you'll notice that your histogram thinks that two of these flowers were either over or underexposed. So it's a really good exercise to really get to understand your camera and how that histogram can really throw off your exposure if you're using it as a guide.
All right. So metering in manual mode. Now, for those of you, I know a lot of you shoot in manual mode, so this is just a review for you. But if you are one of those shooters who does feel a little bit nervous about shooting in manual mode, or you rely on any of your priority modes, here's how to shoot in manual mode and meter and kind of jump out of the box here and be in control of your exposures.
So we're going to try to put all of this together right now into perspective in how we shoot in manual mode. So here's the steps that we take. So when we're shooting in manual mode, most of the time aperture is our priority, meaning that's the first setting that we change on our camera.
One of the first settings. So here we go. So the very first thing when you're shooting in manual mode, the very first thing you'd have to do is put that virtual film in your camera. So you have to select an ISO. You have to tell your camera how sensitive it needs to be to the light. So in this scene here, we're shooting these cactus out there in Tucson, Arizona. And since it was bright, I set my ISO to a low ISO. It could be either, if you're using a Canon, it would be 100, or a Nikon 200. Step 2, you select your aperture. So since in this scene we wanted a really shallow depth of field to blur the foreground and blur the background, we use an aperture of 5.6 or larger. So larger would be f4 or 2.8. Step 3, identify the area in your scene that you want to meter and select a metering mode. Since we wanted to measure a specific area in this scene, I'm going to select the spot metering mode. And the reason why I'm going to select the spot metering mode is because if you look here, there's dark and there are light areas in the scene. So I want to find the neutral area in the scene. And that would be the mid-tone. And that's that little brownish area there. Sometimes it can be something that's green, brown, it doesn't matter. You're looking for the neutral tone in your scene. If we saw in black and white, here we go, you're looking for that 18% gray tone in your scene. And you can find it with your naked eye. You don't always have to carry a gray card around with you.
One of the techniques that I use is when I look at a scene, I'll squint. And when I squint, it's very visible to be able to see the darkest and the lightest part of a scene, and therefore I try to find an area that's kind of in between.
Absolutely. So it's kind of a game, it's a funny drinking game that Val and I play sometimes when we're at restaurants waiting for our food to come, and we do look for the neutral scenes in our area. So it's kind of a fun game to do just with your naked eye. So now we're going to point our camera at the area that we've identified to meter, and we're going to adjust our shutter speed until the exposure level indicator is lined up for a correct exposure. And step number 5, shoot the picture. So, okay, so let's recap on our 5 steps to shooting in manual mode. And I know that we went fast on this, but it is easier than you think it is. So you select an ISO. Number 2, you select an aperture. Number 3, you select a metering mode. And then you point your camera and you adjust your shutter speed till you get that exposure level indicator right in the middle. You focus, you compose, and you shoot. Now, when you refocus your camera to take the picture, your little exposure level indicator line might jump all over the place. Ignore it. Shoot and take the picture because you've already lined it up when you pointed at that neutral tone.
So the only thing that could go wrong is after adjusting your shutter speed, you might have a shutter speed that is too slow for what you're trying to accomplish. So the rule of thumb, the tip that I give to everybody is if your shutter speed is too slow, if you notice it's too slow, then raise your ISO and do step 4 over again. So by raising your ISO higher, it's going to make your image sensor more sensitive to light, forcing faster shutter speeds.
All right, so if you wanted to shoot in manual mode and now you need shutter speed as your priority, you're going to reverse steps 2 and 4. So if the very step number 2, you would then select the shutter speed instead of an aperture. Then you do your metering mode, and then you would adjust your aperture to get the exposure level indicator in the middle.
Yeah, because sometimes you are in sports mode and you need a, let's say for example, a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, and you don't ever want that to move. So you would start with selecting an ISO, and then you would adjust your shutter speed to 1000. Now, after selecting a metering mode, that's when you would adjust your aperture. Now, the aperture, if you're not happy with that aperture setting, then you would have to either raise or lower your ISO.
Mm-hmm. So, metering and exposure tips, this is a bonus for you all. I know your heads are spinning, but that's all right.
Okay, so some of this is a recap, but use spot metering when you want to meter a specific part of your scene. People ask me all the time, should I use spot metering all the time? Well, not necessarily. If you notice that there's a large area in the scene that you can get a reflective light reading from, then you might as well get an average of that part of the scene. You don't need to spot on it. However, when you do use spot, fill your frame as much as you can by zooming in to that area that you're trying to meter to get an accurate exposure.
If that's the neutral tone in your scene.
Correct.
Right.
If you take a look at this girl's face, she has some bright parts of her face, blonde hair, kind of a dark hat. The spot metering is going for an area where part of her cheek is in the shade, and that was actually the neutral area of the scene.
If you're not sure, remember, this is a super tip, and do not be insecure about it. It's always better to slightly underexpose than to overexpose.
When you're overexposing, you're going to remove highlights that are very difficult to get back.
Select your desired ISO before you meter a scene. You have to put that virtual film in your camera before you even think about shooting in manual mode. After you're adjusting your shutter speed for correct exposure, if your shutter speed is too slow, raise your ISO. Write that in sparkly letters. Adjust your shutter speed for correct exposure again. For sharp, non-blurry pictures, make sure that your camera is using a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second or faster when you're hand holding your camera. This is a professional tip. And if your shutter speed is too slow, raise your ISO.
Okay, so we're going to give you an advanced bonus tip here, and so that you can hopefully shoot quicker in manual mode and get the exposures that you need. Because there's times where you don't always have access to a neutral part of your scene. So we've learned so far to identify the neutral tone in our scene to achieve correct exposures. So we're looking for that mid-tone, that middle gray. So once we've identified this area, we then adjust either our aperture or our shutter speed for a correct exposure. Once, of course, we've focused in and pointed our camera to that area. We adjust the shutter speed, line it up at 0, because we found the neutral part of the scene. So after adjusting our setting for a correct exposure, we can now point our camera to different areas within our scene to identify darker or lighter values. Doesn't mean you're going to change the settings on your camera. You'll notice that once you set your camera and you line your exposure level indicator at 0, now if you move your camera around while you're looking through your viewfinder at various other parts of your scene, your needle is going to move. So some areas, if you point your camera to a darker area, your exposure level indicator will tell you, wow, this area right here, the brightness value of this area that's reflecting back to the camera is 1 stop of light darker than a neutral area. This area is 2 stops of light darker. Here's an area that's 1 stop of light brighter, and here's an area that's 2 stops of light brighter. So this is an advanced tip that is very helpful to most photographers and to Stephanie and myself. So in manual mode, after selecting a setting for a correct exposure, you can point your camera to different areas within your scene, and your exposure level indicator will change, but your camera's ISO, aperture, and shutter speed settings will not change. So even though that needle is moving around, your ISO and your aperture and your shutter speed are not changing. They remain exactly where you set
it for the correct exposure. Mm-hmm.
Which means to accomplish a reflective light measurement, you don't always have to find the neutral part of your scene. For example, you can use another brightness value other than the neutral area that might have a larger area to recognize, making it easier to achieve a reflective light measurement. As we notice on the bottom far right, there is a larger area to choose from an area that is 2 stops of light brighter than a neutral area. So all you have to do is point your camera to that area and move your exposure level indicator to match the brightness value that you have identified in your scene. So here's an area that's -1. Here's an area that's -2.
And there's a lot more that was -2. So if you had that, you would just know that you would align it to -2 to get that correct exposure.
Yes. And so by becoming familiar with the different brightness values within your scene, you now have 4 more areas to choose from to accomplish a reflective light measurement. And this takes practice. This takes recognizing, here's a fun exercise. Use a gray card to get a reflective light reading when you're outside in the sun. And now line your exposure level indicator to line it up at 0 for a correct exposure. Now point your camera to the sky. And hopefully you live in an area that has a blue sky. And point your camera to the sky and move your camera around until you find a section of that sky that is the neutral, a neutral tone. And now bring your camera to the lower part of the skyline where it's brighter, and you'll notice that that might be 1 stop of light or even 2 stops of light brighter. So you can find various brightness values just in a sky that you now have a giant gray card you can use.
So there are many more options when metering for a correct exposure. You just got to follow the 5 simple steps of shooting in manual mode. So let's do it really quick. Step 1 is you're going to set your ISO. Step 2, you set your aperture if you're using aperture as your priority. Step 3, select a metering mode so you can measure the light in the area that you've identified in your scene. Step 4, Adjust your shutter speed to move your exposure level indicator to match the brightness level that you've identified for correct exposure by adjusting your shutter speed dial. So when you shoot in manual mode, you can then, step number 5, focus, compose, and shoot. Just take the darn picture. And by challenging yourself to find different brightness values within your scene, you'll get faster at achieving the settings that you want, so you don't miss that important shot. So thanks a whole bunch. Congratulations, you've just completed the metering and measuring light for the correct exposure. And now you're ready to move on to the next step. Lighting and composition. So you can take the rest of our course, and the way to get the rest of the course is you can go to capturingtrueemotion.com and you select the online photography course. You can use the coupon code Love My Camera so you can get a 75% discount, or
let's just make sure everybody has an opportunity to write this down. So capturingtrueemotion.com if you want a discounted online course, and be sure Love My Camera is all lowercase, no spaces. So when you go to checkout, you're going to notice that the course is $250, and this will now make the course $60 over a 75% discount. If you want the online course for free,
yes,
we have a listing company. Capturing True Emotion Photography is a listing company for certified professional photographers. Your most trusted source for finding a certified professional photographer. If you meet our requirements, then you can register for free and have a lifetime listing as a beta tester. So we haven't gone live yet. So if you're interested, even to see if you'll be qualified or not, go to capturingtrueemotion.com/beta, BETA, /photographer-coupon. And the code that we are using is all uppercase, collages1. That code will give you a free lifetime listing, and not only will you get a free lifetime listing, you'll always have access to the online course, every one of these modules, which you...
I mean, everyone always needs the basics, and even if you just want a refresher and take a peek at what our ideas of and how we shoot in manual mode, how we shoot and achieve our exposures and composition, that's how we do it. So also we do our private coaching, and you know, I have so many coaching students that are pros and that are looking to better their business, so we have that, and then we also have quite a few beginners that just want to take their photography to another level.
Right now, our coaching students, and not just our coaching students, it's actually available to anyone that wants to join us. We are going in September, the first part of September, to Montana Horses. It is one of the largest horse ranches out there. Stephanie and I have been doing photography expedition there over the last 10 years.
Yeah, since 2009.
And if you want to find out about that expedition, we have a few spots available. Just go to valwestoverphotography.com and look at one of our current blog posts. So we want to hear from you, especially if you have questions. We want to make sure that you're successful in your photography. So if you have questions in regard to what we presented to you today, please don't hesitate to email us or call us. That's what we're here for. And if you want to know about our listing company and you have questions about that, or our photography coaching program, valwestover@gmail.com is probably the best email. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And also feel free to give us a call. We love talking to you all.
And thank you so much for your time. We know we threw a lot of information at you, and however, we just want to make sure that you have access to the course at a later date if you need it. And I believe this is also being recorded, so this particular segment right here, you'll go to collages.
Is this collages.net? And
yeah, you go to YouTube and just search their videos at collages.net.